At 200 hours on October 25, 1944, Private Rudy Tokiwa shouldered his M1 Garand and moved through freezing rain toward the assembly point in the Vosges Mountains, as word spread through the ranks that 275 American soldiers were trapped 4 miles northeast, surrounded by an estimated 6,000 German troops. The 19-year-old Tokiwa had survived 9 consecutive days of brutal combat with K Company, 442nd Regimental Combat Team, fighting house to house through Bruyères and Bifontaine. But this morning, after barely 36 hours of rest, his regiment, a segregated unit of Japanese-American soldiers whose families remained imprisoned in internment camps across the United States, was being recalled to the front when 2 previous rescue attempts by the 141st Regiment had failed with heavy casualties. In the preceding weeks, German forces throughout the Vosges had repelled multiple Allied advances through terrain so dense that visibility rarely exceeded 12 yards, and mines claimed soldiers with every step. His unit, K Company, mustered 186 men carrying M1 rifles, BARs, and enough ammunition for approximately 6 days of sustained close-quarters combat. The enemy force consisted of elements from multiple Wehrmacht divisions, including SS mountain troops, positioned in layered defensive lines throughout the Forêt Dominale de Champs. Fir trees rising 60 to 200 feet, creating perpetual gloom on the forest floor. Intelligence reports indicated that Hitler himself had issued orders that the surrounded Americans, designated as the Lost Battalion, must be annihilated before rescue could arrive. Please like, share, and subscribe to this channel for more World War II stories. On December 7, 1941, as smoke rose from Pearl Harbor, 19-year-old Rudy Tokiwa stood in the lettuce fields of his family's farm in Salinas, California, listening to the radio reports and knowing with absolute certainty that his life had just changed forever. Within weeks, the government reclassified 120,000 Japanese Americans, 2/3 of them American citizens by birth, as 4C enemy aliens. By March 1942, Executive Order 9066 authorized their removal from the West Coast. Tokiwa's family received 10 days to sell everything they owned before buses arrived to transport them 500 miles inland to Poston War Relocation Center in the Arizona desert. Poston sprawled across 71,000 acres of barren land, where summer temperatures exceeded 125 degrees and dust storms turned day into night. Guard towers ringed the perimeter. Barbed wire gleamed in the sun. Families of 5 lived in single rooms measuring 20 by 24 feet, separated by thin partitions that allowed every conversation, every argument, every moment of despair to echo through the barracks. At Manzanar, in California's Owens Valley, at Heart Mountain in Wyoming, at Topaz in Utah, the scene repeated. 110,000 people stripped of homes, businesses, dignity, imprisoned without trial or charge in camps administered by the War Relocation Authority. Then, on February 1, 1943, President Roosevelt announced the formation of the 442nd Regimental Combat Team, declaring that Americanism is not and never was a matter of race or ancestry. The War Department would accept Japanese-American volunteers for military service. Behind the barbed wire, men received a loyalty questionnaire containing 2 questions that would define their generation. Question 27. Are you willing to serve in the armed forces of the United States on combat duty, wherever ordered? Question 28. Will you swear unqualified allegiance to the United States of America and forswear any form of allegiance or obedience to the Japanese Emperor? Tokiwa stared at the form in his barrack at Poston, his parents sleeping 15 feet away behind a partition. The moral calculation was staggering. His mother and father remained imprisoned, yet the government asked him to risk his life, proving loyalty that should never have been questioned. Some men answered no to both questions in protest. The no boys, who would face persecution from both government and community. Others, like Tokiwa, answered yes, driven by a need to prove what should have been self-evident. In Spokane, Washington, Fred Shiosaki received different news. His family, living east of the exclusion zone, escaped internment. But his friends, his community, his people sat behind wire. When the call came for the 442nd, Shiosaki volunteered immediately, determined to fight for those who couldn't. From Hawaii, where Japanese Americans comprised 37% of the population and mass internment proved logistically impossible, men like Mutt Sakamoto enlisted in overwhelming numbers. The Hawaiian Nisei brought a different energy, less burdened by mainlanders' need to prove loyalty, more confident in their American identity, carrying a motto from the gambling halls of Honolulu: "Go for broke. Risk everything on one great effort." By May 1943, over 12,000 men had volunteered. They reported to Camp Shelby, Mississippi, where they confronted another American reality: Jim Crow segregation. Japanese American soldiers trained to fight fascism in a state where they couldn't eat in white restaurants or drink from white water fountains. They learned weapons, tactics, and unit cohesion, while the 100th Infantry Battalion, formed earlier from Hawaiian soldiers, fought in Italy, earning the nickname Purple Heart Battalion for casualties that foreshadowed what awaited the 442nd. On the dusty parade grounds of Camp Shelby, as formations practiced close order drill, the Hawaiian phrase echoed through the ranks: "Go for broke." They didn't yet know the price that motto would demand. On June 26, 1944, the 442nd Regimental Combat Team arrived at the Anzio beachhead in Italy and immediately merged with the 100th Infantry Battalion, the Purple Heart Battalion that had already fought through Salerno, Monte Cassino, and the Gothic Line. The 100th survivors, hardened by months of combat that had reduced the battalion to half strength, eyed the fresh-faced replacements with measured skepticism. That skepticism evaporated at Belvedere when the combined force fought through German defensive positions in hill country so steep that men climbed hand over hand while carrying 60-pound packs. The 442nd took its first casualties, 16 killed, 67 wounded, and learned what the 100th already knew. Courage meant advancing when every instinct screamed to dig in and hide. By September 1944, the regiment shipped to France and attached to the 36th Texas Infantry Division under Major General John E. Dahlquist. The Texans had landed at Salerno, fought at Monte Cassino, and participated in Operation Dragoon, the invasion of southern France. They were tired, under strength, and wary of the Japanese-American unit joining their ranks. On October 8th, the 442nd arrived in the Vosges Mountains, wearing summer uniforms as autumn rain turned to sleet, and temperatures dropped toward freezing at night. The Vosges presented terrain unlike anything they'd encountered in Italy. Dense forests stretched across mountainous ridges where fir trees rose 60 to 200 feet, their canopies blocking sunlight and reducing visibility to 12 yards on clear days, less in fog. The forest floor, perpetually damp and shadowed, concealed mines, foxholes, and machine gun nests impossible to detect until men died. German forces had occupied these mountains for 4 years, fortifying positions not breached militarily since Roman legions marched through 2 millennia earlier. October 15th, the order came to advance on Bruyères, a town of 3,000 residents held by elements of the Wehrmacht's 716th Infantry Division. For 9 consecutive days, the 442nd fought through forests where German artillery crews had perfected a devastating technique: tree bursts. Shells timed to explode 50 feet above ground in the treetops, sending shrapnel and wooden spears raining down on soldiers who couldn't dig deep enough to escape. Men learned to recognize the whistle of incoming rounds and press themselves into mud, praying the burst wouldn't detonate directly overhead. House-to-house fighting in Bruyères cost dozens of casualties as German snipers fired from second-story windows and machine gun teams defended every intersection. Engineers from the 232nd Combat Engineer Company probed roads for teller mines and shoe mines, wooden boxes filled with TNT that metal detectors couldn't locate. October 19th, Bruyères fell. October 20th, orders arrived to take Bifontaine, 3 miles northeast. The assault on Bifontaine produced some of the fiercest combat the regiment had faced. German counterattacks supported by armor pushed through American lines. Foxholes became graves. Medics worked under fire, dragging wounded men through mud, while artillery pounded positions from both sides. Private James Matsumoto, serving with the 232nd, later recalled, "There were so many dead people on the road, they had to bring a bulldozer to push them off the road." October 23rd evening, Bifontaine secured. The 442nd received orders to pull back for rest, 5 days behind the lines. Hot food arrived, clean uniforms. Men stripped off boots caked with mud and blood, revealing feet white with trench foot. Some slept for 18 hours straight, collapsing in their bedrolls fully clothed. The cost of 9 days, 140 casualties, including 30 killed. K Company counted 162 men present for duty from 186 who'd entered the forest. 36 hours later, the sergeants came through the bivouac area, rousing men from the first real sleep they'd had in weeks. The 442nd was being recalled to the front. On October 24, 1944, the 1st Battalion, 141st Infantry Regiment, moved through Bifontaine to relieve the exhausted soldiers of the 442nd. Lieutenant Marty Higgins, a 28-year-old former cavalry officer who'd served with Buffalo Soldiers before the war, led his company of Texas National Guardsmen into positions the Nisei had just vacated. The 141st carried the nickname Alamo Regiment from their service in World War I, a designation that now carried unintended weight. Higgins commanded approximately 275 men from Companies A, B, C, and elements of the 2nd and 3rd Battalions, mostly farm boys and small-town Texans who'd trained together at Camp Bowie before deploying to Italy in 1943. That afternoon, Major General John Dahlquist issued orders that made Higgins and his battalion commanders exchange worried glances. The 1st Battalion would advance 4 miles northeast beyond friendly forces toward the town of La Houssière, pushing deeper into the Vosges to seize French territory before winter set in. Officers protested. Extending that far without flank support invited encirclement. Dahlquist dismissed the concerns. Intelligence suggested German forces were withdrawing. The advance would proceed at dawn. October 25th, 0600 hours. The 1st Battalion pushed through dense forest in morning fog, encountering minimal resistance. By midday, they'd advanced 3 miles along a narrow ridge near the hamlet of Bifontaine, overlooking the Meurthe River Valley. The ease of the advance should have triggered alarm. German forces hadn't withdrawn. They'd simply moved aside, allowing the Americans to walk into a carefully prepared kill zone. At 1400 hours, German artillery opened fire from 3 sides simultaneously. Wehrmacht units, including elements of the 716th Volksgrenadier Division reinforced by SS Mountain troops and the 202nd Gebirgsjäger Regiment, closed the trap with approximately 6,000 soldiers. Intelligence intercepts later revealed that Adolf Hitler had taken personal interest in the encircled Americans, issuing explicit orders to Wehrmacht commanders. The Lost Battalion must be annihilated. No surrender would be accepted. No retreat permitted. Higgins ordered his men to establish defensive positions on a ridge offering high ground advantage, their only tactical asset in an otherwise catastrophic situation. Freezing rain began falling that evening. Fog reduced visibility to arm's length. Ammunition counts revealed enough for perhaps 2 days of sustained combat. Rations, 1 day. Water, whatever could be collected from rain and streams within the shrinking perimeter. October 25th, afternoon. 2 battalions from the 141st Regiment launched rescue attempts, both repulsed with heavy casualties before advancing 500 yards. A 36-man patrol attempted to break out and reach American lines. 5 returned, carrying wounded and reporting German positions so dense that further breakout attempts would result in complete annihilation. Overhead, P-47 Thunderbolts from the 405th Fighter Squadron roared through gaps in the weather, pilots attempting low-altitude supply drops. Colored parachutes blossomed, carrying rations, ammunition, medical supplies, but most drifted into German-held territory. Soldiers watched desperately as packages meant for them landed 100 yards beyond their perimeter, immediately seized by enemy troops who used the supplies to sustain their siege. By October 25th evening, the situation had crystallized into stark mathematics. The Lost Battalion, now officially designated such by 36th Division headquarters, numbered 275 men surrounded by 6,000, with supplies for less than 48 hours, and rescue attempts failing bloodily. Radio communication remained operational, but each transmission brought the same message from battalion command: "Hold on. Help is coming." In his headquarters, General Dahlquist studied maps showing the surrounded battalion's position and the shattered rescue attempts. 1 unit remained available, exhausted, under strength, but with a reputation for achieving impossible objectives. At 2,000 hours, runners departed for the 442nd's bivouac area, carrying orders that would reshape American military history. At 200 hours on October 26, 1944, sergeants moved through the 442nd's bivouac area, shaking men awake after barely 36 hours of rest. Rudy Tokiwa jerked upright in his bedroll, disoriented, feeling like he'd only just closed his eyes. Around him, hundreds of soldiers pulled on boots still damp from 9 days in the Vosges mud, reaching for rifles and gear they'd hoped not to touch for 5 more days. Within 30 minutes, company commanders assembled their men in the pre-dawn darkness for briefing. The situation: 275 American soldiers from the 141st Regiment trapped 4 miles northeast, surrounded by an estimated 6,000 German troops. 2 rescue attempts by other battalions of the 141st had failed with heavy casualties. The 442nd would advance at 0400 hours to break through and extract the surrounded battalion. Officers kept the briefing clinical, factual, avoiding what every man in formation immediately understood. They were being sent to complete a mission their own countrymen couldn't finish. In K Company's formation, Tokiwa turned to the soldier beside him and asked the question that would haunt survivors for decades. Why didn't they use their own people? Why us? Was it because we were Japanese? Private Larry Sakota, standing 3 rows back, voiced what others were thinking. How come they don't use the other regiments? The 36th Division has 3 times the men we have. The mathematics were brutal and obvious. The 442nd mustered approximately 2,800 men present for duty after casualties from Bruyères and Bifontaine. The 36th Infantry Division, of which the 442nd was technically attached but not integrated, fielded over 10,000 soldiers across 3 full regiments. Yet General Dahlquist had recalled the one unit already decimated by 9 consecutive days of forest combat. K Company counted 186 men in formation. I Company, 200. The 100th Battalion, 2nd Battalion, and 3rd Battalion all stood under strength. Companies that should have fielded 200 men each now mustering 140 to 160 effectives. No one spoke the answer aloud, but it hung in the cold air between the formations. They were expendable in ways other American units were not. At 0400 hours, the advance began in total darkness through the Forêt Dominale de Champs. Fred Shiosaki, moving forward with K Company, later described the conditions. It was blacker than the inside of a wolf. Fog had rolled in overnight, mixing with the perpetual gloom beneath fir trees that rose 60 to 200 feet overhead. Visibility, less than arm's length. Men gripped the pack straps of the soldier ahead, moving through darkness so complete that soldiers literally could not see their own hands extended in front of them. The forest floor had never seen direct sunlight. Centuries of fallen needles created a spongy, treacherous surface that concealed roots, holes, and German shoe mines designed to blow off feet. Engineers from the 232nd Combat Engineer Company moved ahead with bayonets, probing the ground inch by inch, while the infantry waited in frozen columns. Progress measured in yards per hour. At 0600 hours, the column halted. Ahead, the terrain dropped into a steep ravine, invisible in the darkness. Officers conferred by shielded flashlight, studying maps that couldn't capture the reality of moving thousands of men through this terrain. Behind them, stretched along a narrow trail, the 442nd waited in silence, rifles ready, every man knowing that somewhere ahead in the Black Forest, 6,000 Germans waited in prepared positions, while 275 Americans counted their remaining hours. October 26th, 0800 hours. First contact came as a burst of MG-42 fire that tore through K Company's lead squad, killing 3 men before anyone saw the muzzle flash. The German defensive line wasn't a line at all. It was everywhere and nowhere, a network of concealed positions so thoroughly integrated into the forest that soldiers died without ever seeing their killers. Machine gun nests occupied positions behind every third tree, firing from foxholes roofed with logs and camouflaged with pine branches. Visibility remained 12 yards maximum in the fog, reducing combat to point-blank range where men fired at shadows and sounds. At 10:15 hours, German artillery opened fire with tree bursts, shells timed to detonate in the canopy 50 feet overhead. Each explosion sent shrapnel and wooden spears radiating downward in a cone of death that penetrated foxholes and turned trees into fragmentation weapons. Men learned to recognize the whistle shriek of incoming rounds and press themselves flat, knowing that vertical cover meant nothing against an attack from above. The advance that day, 500 yards, purchased with dozens of casualties, approximately 40 killed or wounded by nightfall. Snipers added to the carnage, firing from platforms 100 feet up in the dense canopy where detection proved impossible. A man would be walking, then suddenly drop with a bullet through his helmet. No shot heard. No position identified. Medics worked under constant fire, dragging wounded through mud while artillery pounded positions from both sides. October 27th brought 2 major German counterattacks, both supported by Mark IV tanks and armored cars that crashed through undergrowth with infantry behind them. The 442nd's line bent but held, though the cost mounted exponentially. Fighting devolved into hand-to-hand combat in muddy trenches, bayonets, rifle butts, entrenching tools, knives. Private George Sakato, firing his bar until the barrel glowed red, later recalled, "Lines were so close, we jumped into any hole to avoid our own artillery." The 522nd Field Artillery Battalion fired continuously in support, but forward observers struggled with target identification when enemy positions sat within 50 yards of American lines. Rounds landed so close that soldiers felt concussion waves slam through their chests. Engineers from the 232nd Combat Engineer Company continued probing for mines under fire, advancing inches at a time with bayonets, while machine gun rounds kicked up dirt around them. Every yard gained cost blood, sometimes multiple casualties for a single meter of advance. October 28th, the darkest day. K Company's morning roll call revealed approximately 40 men present from the 186 who'd entered the forest. I Company counted roughly 20 effectives from 200. Men who'd fought continuously for 17 days since Bruyères began showing signs of complete physical collapse. Hypothermia from wet uniforms that never dried, trench foot turning feet black and numb, exhaustion so profound that soldiers fell asleep standing in foxholes. At 14:30 hours, the radio crackled with intelligence from division headquarters. Intercepted German communications confirmed Adolf Hitler's personal interest in the Lost Battalion's annihilation. Wehrmacht commanders had received explicit orders: the surrounded Americans must not be rescued. Fresh troops were moving into blocking positions. 4 miles ahead, Lieutenant Higgins received a supply drop via parachute, the first successful delivery in 3 days. Along with rations came replacement radio batteries. He immediately transmitted, "Thank our pals in the Air Corps. We eat for the first time in 3 days." The message reached 442nd Command, confirming the Lost Battalion still held but couldn't survive much longer. That night, soldiers of the 442nd slept in foxholes filled with freezing water, weapons cradled against their chests, knowing that dawn would bring another day of grinding forward through an enemy that refused to break. October 29th, 06:30 hours. After 5 days of combat, the 442nd had advanced approximately 2 miles through the Vosges, each yard purchased with casualties that now totaled over 400 killed and wounded. At dawn, the remnants of I and K companies found themselves pinned on a narrow ridge barely 30 yards wide, with steep drops falling away on both sides into ravines choked with German positions. No room to maneuver. No flanking route. Nowhere to hide. Directly ahead, 150 yards upslope, German machine gun nests occupied fortified positions on higher ground, MG-42s in log-reinforced bunkers with interlocking fields of fire that turned the ridge into a kill zone. At 7:15 hours, K Company attempted to advance. 8 men died in the first 3 minutes. 21 more fell wounded, dragged back to cover by medics who worked under continuous fire. The mathematics of the situation were brutally simple. Continue the frontal assault and die slowly, 1 squad at a time, or attempt something desperate that might, maybe, break the stalemate. Private Barney Hajiro crouched in his foxhole, gripping his Browning automatic rifle. The 24-year-old from Maui had already been recommended for extraordinary heroism during the Bruyères campaign, single-handedly destroying 2 machine gun positions while wounded. Now, watching men die trying to advance through tactics that couldn't work, he made a calculation that defied every principle of infantry doctrine. At 0742 hours, Hajiro rose from his foxhole, without orders, without covering fire, without waiting for support. He began running uphill directly toward the German positions, BAR at his hip, firing 20-round magazines in controlled bursts. His voice carried across the ridge over the sound of machine guns. Go for broke! The German gunners, shocked by the lone figure charging through their fire, hesitated for perhaps 2 seconds, long enough for Hajiro to cover 30 yards before they adjusted. Bullets tore through the air around him, kicking up mud, splintering trees. He didn't stop. At 50 yards, he dropped to one knee, changed magazines, and resumed firing. A burst from his bar raked the first machine gun nest. The German crew slumped. Hajiro moved forward. Behind him, other soldiers rose from their positions, a handful at first, then more. If one man could charge into that hellfire, they could follow. The cry echoed down the line, "Go for broke!" Hajiro reached the second machine gun position at 75 yards and destroyed it with grenades and point-blank bar fire, killing multiple German soldiers. He continued upward, one man against a fortified line, clearing the path through sheer audacity and impossible courage. By the time he reached the crest at 100 yards, the main German position had broken, survivors retreating rather than face what seemed like supernatural determination. The cost was staggering. Of the men who followed Hajiro up that ridge, more than half fell killed or wounded. But the position was taken, the deadlock broken. This single act would become one of 5 Medal of Honor actions performed by 442nd soldiers in the Vosges, though Hajiro's wouldn't be officially recognized until 2000, when a review of denied medals finally acknowledged what his brothers had witnessed that morning. Behind the captured ridge, the main force of the 442nd pushed through the breach Hajiro had created. By late afternoon, they could hear German artillery shifting focus, no longer firing at approaching Americans, but concentrating on a position approximately 1 mile ahead. The Lost Battalion. The Germans knew rescue was imminent and were preparing to finish the surrounded Texans before help could arrive. October 30th, 05:45 hours, the 522nd Field Artillery Battalion opened fire with everything available. 100 mm howitzers pounding German positions in a 20-minute bombardment designed to stun defenders before the final assault. The 442nd assembled for what would be the 6th consecutive day of attack, but the regiment that formed in the pre-dawn darkness bore little resemblance to the force that had entered the forest. Companies that had mustered 180 to 200 men now fielded 20 to 40 effective soldiers. K Company counted 17 men present for duty. I Company chartered 8. The 100th Battalion, 2nd Battalion, and 3rd Battalion all operated at approximately half strength in fighting units. But intelligence confirmed they were within reach, perhaps 1,000 yards from the Lost Battalion's position. At 06:15 hours, the attack began as a coordinated push across a broad front. What remained of the 442nd moved forward through artillery smoke, knowing this had to be the day. The Lost Battalion couldn't survive another night. German resistance proved fanatical. Wehrmacht commanders understood that failure meant disgrace. Hitler himself had ordered the Americans annihilated, and now rescue was imminent. Soldiers who might have retreated 2 days earlier now fought with desperate determination, turning every foxhole into a strong point, every tree into cover for a last stand. Combat devolved into close-quarters violence in undergrowth so dense that soldiers fought at arm's length. No room for tactics, no space for maneuver, just will against will, endurance against endurance. At 11:47 hours, German artillery shifted targets entirely. Rounds that had been falling on advancing Americans suddenly began pounding the Lost Battalion's position with renewed intensity. The message was clear. If the Germans couldn't hold the line, they would finish the surrounded Texans before rescue arrived. 4 miles ahead on the ridge, Lieutenant Higgins pressed himself into his foxhole as 88 mm shells screamed overhead, and detonated in airbursts above his position. Around him, 211 men, all that remained of 275, crouched in muddy holes down to their final magazines of ammunition after 6 days of siege. Some had fewer than 10 rounds left. Higgins listened to the bombardment and understood its meaning. Help was close, but time was running out. The Germans were making their final attempt to complete Hitler's order before the 442nd could break through. At 13:18 hours, elements of I Company, now reduced to 8 men under Sergeant Francis Nakata, penetrated a gap in the German line where Hajiro's charge had shattered defensive cohesion. They pushed forward through smoke and shattered trees, moving towards sounds of artillery falling ahead. At 13:42 hours, Private First Class Mutt Sakamoto emerged from dense undergrowth into a small clearing and froze. Through drifting smoke, he saw American uniforms 50 yards ahead. Soldiers in foxholes, weapons trained toward him. His finger tensed on his M1's trigger. The figures ahead did the same. In the chaos of 6 days fighting, with German soldiers sometimes wearing captured American gear, identification was uncertain at best. For 3 seconds that felt like minutes, neither side fired. Then someone ahead lowered their rifle and called out, "Texas! 141st Regiment!" Sakamoto shouldered his weapon and walked forward, pulling a pack of Lucky Strikes from his jacket pocket. Behind him, the shattered remnants of the 442nd Regimental Combat Team began emerging from the forest, bloodied, exhausted, victorious. After 6 days of the most savage combat in their history, after losing more men than they were saving, they had broken through. October 30th, 1347 hours. Private First Class Mutt Sakamoto walked through the Lost Battalion's perimeter, uniform caked with 6 days of Vosges mud. Blood from a dozen minor wounds dried on his hands and face. Exhaustion carved into every line of his body. Around him, 211 Texas National Guardsmen stared from foxholes. Gaunt faces, hollow eyes, uniforms rotted from constant rain, barely able to process that rescue had finally arrived. More than 60 of their brothers lay dead or critically wounded after 6 days of German siege. Some of the survivors had been reduced to melting snow for water and rationing their final ammunition, counting single rounds. Sakamoto spotted Lieutenant Martin Higgins standing near the command post, a 28-year-old cavalry officer who'd served with Buffalo Soldiers before the war, now carrying the weight of 6 days commanding men who'd believed they might die on this ridge. Higgins watched the Japanese-American soldiers emerging from the forest, weapons ready, moving with the careful efficiency of men who'd fought through hell to reach this position. Sakamoto walked directly to Higgins. For a moment, the two men simply looked at each other, rescuer and rescued, both understanding what this moment cost. Then, Sakamoto reached into his jacket pocket with studied casualness and pulled out a pack of Lucky Strikes. He extended them toward Higgins. "Cigarette?" Higgins accepted, hands trembling. Whether from exhaustion, relief, or emotion, he couldn't have said. The gesture carried more weight than words could express. Not triumph, not ceremony, just one soldier offering another soldier a smoke after the worst week either had known. Private Ed Guy, one of the rescued Texans, watched the scene unfold and later recalled, "I might have hugged him. I don't know. I was just excited to get out of there." Major Claude D. Roscoe of the 141st Regiment transmitted the message that would reach division headquarters within the hour. To our great pleasure, it was members of the 442nd Combat Team. The evacuation began immediately. Nisei soldiers helped walking wounded to their feet, lifted stretchers carrying men too injured to move, shared their rations with Texans who hadn't eaten in 3 days. Some of the rescued men were seeing Japanese-American soldiers for the first time. Texas farm boys raised on prejudices they'd never questioned, now being carried to safety by men they'd been taught to distrust. The contradiction was impossible to ignore. Men whose families sat imprisoned behind barbed wire in American camps had just risked everything to save men whose families remained free. The irony wasn't lost on anyone present. Behind them, scattered across 2 miles of forest floor, on ridges and in ravines, lay more than 800 casualties from the 442nd, over 140 dead, more than 660 wounded. K Company's count, 17 men walking out from 186 who'd walked in 6 days earlier. I Company, 8 from 200. The mathematics of rescue had proven brutal. Nearly 4 casualties suffered for every man saved. As the combined force withdrew through the breach the 442nd had carved, German artillery resumed firing, shells crashing into positions the Americans had just vacated, pounding empty foxholes in futile rage. The sound followed them through the forest, a reminder of what they'd survived and what they'd left behind. That night, in field hospitals behind the lines, surgeons worked through darkness treating the wounded. In bivouac areas, the survivors of the 442nd collapsed into sleep so deep that some couldn't be woken for roll call the next morning. The rescue had succeeded. The Lost Battalion had been saved. But the question already forming in whispered conversations around campfires would haunt veterans for the rest of their lives. At what price? And for whom? November 3, 1944. 3 days after rescuing the Lost Battalion, the 442nd received orders to continue operations. 9 more days pushing through the Vosges against determined German resistance. The total campaign stretched to 34 days of nearly continuous combat. Final casualties for the entire Vosges operation: approximately 160 killed, over 1,200 wounded. For the Lost Battalion rescue alone, estimates ranged from 400 to 800 casualties, depending on how the accounting was performed. Some sources counted only the 6-day rescue operation, others included related combat actions. Either calculation produced the same haunting mathematics: more casualties suffered than men saved. November 12, 1944. Major General John Dahlquist ordered the 442nd Regimental Combat Team to assemble on a field near Bruyères for a formal ceremony. Presidential unit citations would be awarded to the 100th Battalion, 2nd Battalion, 3rd Battalion, and 232nd Combat Engineer Company. Recognition for extraordinary heroism during the Vosges campaign. The general arrived expecting to review a full regiment of several thousand soldiers. The formation that assembled numbered a few hundred men. Dahlquist surveyed the sparse ranks, his face darkening. He turned to Colonel Virgil R. Miller, commander of the 442nd, anger clear in his voice. "Colonel, I ordered the entire regiment to assemble. You disobeyed my orders." Miller faced the general, tears streaming down his face. "General, this is the regiment. The rest are either dead or in the hospital." Silence fell across the field. The citation ceremony proceeded. Survivors stood in formation, many still bandaged, some on crutches, all carrying the weight of men who'd seen too much and lost too many. As citations were read and medals pinned, no one could escape the moral arithmetic. The 442nd had saved 211 men at a cost exceeding 800 casualties. Did the math of heroism require this price? Why had they, outnumbered 4-1 by other units in the 36th Division, been chosen for a mission others had failed? Were they honored for their excellence or exploited for their expendability? What did it mean to die proving loyalty to a country that had doubted it from the beginning? The survivors carried these questions for the rest of their lives. The legacy unfolded across decades. The 442nd became the most decorated unit for its size and length of service in American military history. 21 Medals of Honor, most awarded in 2000 after systematic review of denied medals, over 4,000 Purple Hearts, 8 Presidential Unit citations. The Lost Battalion rescue was designated one of the top 10 battles in U.S. Army history. In 1962, Texas Governor John Connally made all 442nd members honorary Texans. In 2012, surviving members received France's Légion d'honneur. Rudy Tokiwa survived the war and became a leader in the Japanese-American redress movement, fighting for recognition of internment injustice and ultimately winning acknowledgement and reparations from the U.S. government in 1988. Fred Shiosaki, one of 17 survivors from K Company's original 186 men, spent decades processing survivors' guilt, asking why he lived when 169 brothers died. In 2010, Congress awarded the Congressional Gold Medal to the 442nd Regimental Combat Team, the 100th Infantry Battalion, and Nisei serving in military intelligence. The question was never fully answered: what they proved, and what it cost to prove it. On the parade ground at Camp Shelby, Mississippi, where it all began in 1943, a memorial now stands. The motto remains carved in stone. Go for broke. The price paid. Everything. The lesson learned. Citizenship can be earned in blood. But decades later, the question still lingers in the words of those who survived. Should it have had to be?